Nevertheless, you see what he thinks of Hume's argument. It's not merely a failure, it is an abject failure. That is to say, it is demonstrably, irremediably, hopelessly fallacious.
Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Today I've stumbled across this video where William Lane Craig, one of the most respected Christian philosophers in the world, goes head-to-head with Bart Ehrman, a former evangelical turned agnostic scholar, in a debate about whether the resurrection of Jesus can be proven historically. And let me tell you, Craig does not hold back. He literally names Ehrman's mistakes on stage and calls his entire argument, and I quote, demonstrably, irremediably, hopelessly fallacious. So make sure you watch until the end, and please comment down below where you're watching from. I really love to see people from all over the world connecting in here. Alright, now, let's get into the video.
Thank you, Bart. I see we're in for a good debate this evening. Now, you'll recall that I laid out two basic contentions that I would defend tonight. First, there are four facts which any adequate historical hypothesis must account for. And second, that the resurrection of Jesus is the best explanation of those facts. Now, I want to skip over that first contention for the time being and go straight to the second, because this is the key issue dividing Dr. Ehrman and myself. Dr. Ehrman maintains that we can never say that a miracle like the resurrection probably occurred because miracles by their very nature are inherently improbable. Now, despite what he says, this argument is nothing new. It was already propounded in the 18th century by David Hume in his essay Of Miracles. Dr. Ehrman's argument is just a warmed-over version of Hume's reasoning. Now, what do contemporary philosophers think of Hume's argument against the identification of miracles? Well, let me introduce you to another Ehrman, John Earman, professor of philosophy of science at University of Pittsburgh. This Professor Ehrman is not a Christian. In fact, he's an agnostic. He doesn't even believe God exists. Nevertheless, you see what he thinks of Hume's argument. It's not merely a failure, it is an abject failure. That is to say, it is demonstrably, irremediably, hopelessly fallacious. Let me explain why. When we talk about the probability of some event or hypothesis A, that probability is always relative to a body of background information B. So we speak of the probability of A on B, or of A with respect to B. So, in order to figure out the probability of the resurrection, let B stand for our background knowledge of the world apart from any evidence for the resurrection. Let E stand for the specific evidence for Jesus' resurrection, the empty tomb, post-mortem appearances, and so on. Finally, let R stand for Jesus' resurrection. Now, what we want to figure out is the probability of Jesus' resurrection given our background knowledge of the world and the specific evidence in this case. Now, probability theorists have developed a very complicated formula for calculating probabilities like this, and I'm going to walk you through it one step at a time so that you'll be able to get it. The first factor that we need to consider is the probability of the resurrection on the background knowledge alone. This is called the intrinsic probability of the resurrection. It tells how probable the resurrection is given our general knowledge of the world. Next, we multiply that by the probability of the evidence given our background knowledge and the resurrection. This is called the explanatory power of the resurrection hypothesis. It tells how probable the resurrection makes the evidence of the empty tomb and so forth. And these two factors form the numerator of this ratio. Now, below the line, just reproduce the numerator. Just move everything above the line down below the line. Finally, we add to that the product of two more factors. The intrinsic probability that Jesus did not rise from the dead, plus, or rather times, the explanatory power of the hypothesis of no resurrection. And basically, this is the intrinsic probability and explanatory power of all the naturalistic explanations of Jesus' resurrection. So, the probability of Jesus' resurrection relative to our background information and the specific evidence is equal to this complicated ratio. And now we're ready to see exactly where Dr. Ehrman's error lies. So, in the grand tradition of Hume's abject failure, I give you Ehrman's egregious error. He says, because historians can only establish what probably happened, And a miracle of this nature is highly improbable. The historian cannot say it probably occurred. In other words, in calculating the probability of Jesus' resurrection, the only factor he considers is the intrinsic probability of the resurrection alone. He just ignores all the other factors, and that's just mathematically.
This is the moment where the entire debate shifts. Because what William Lane Craig is about to do here is not just respond to Bart Ehrman. He is about to dismantle the entire philosophical foundation that Ehrman has been standing on. And here is what makes this so devastating. Craig does not just say Ehrman is wrong. He brings in a third party, an agnostic philosopher, someone who has no dog in this fight, someone who does not believe in God. And Craig points out that even this philosopher thinks Ehrman's argument is a complete disaster. Craig says this: Dr. Ehrman's argument is just a warmed over version of Hume's reasoning. You hear that? Warmed over. He is saying Ehrman did not even come up with something original. He just recycled an 18th century argument that philosophers have already torn apart for centuries. And then Craig introduces John Earman from the University of Pittsburgh, and he makes sure you understand something crucial. He says this professor is not a Christian. In fact, he is an agnostic. He does not even believe God exists. So this is not some biased Christian scholar defending his team. This is a neutral academic. And what does this agnostic philosopher think of the argument Ehrman is using? Craig delivers the verdict. It is not merely a failure. It is an abject failure. That is to say, it is demonstrably, irremediably, hopelessly fallacious. Hopelessly fallacious. Those are not my words. Those are not Craig's words. Those are the words of an agnostic philosopher describing the exact argument Ehrman just used. And if you do not understand why this matters, let me explain. In academic debates, there is nothing more powerful than bringing in a hostile witness, someone who should be on the other side, but cannot defend it because the logic is that bad. Craig just did that. He found an agnostic who looked at Hume's argument and said, this does not work. This cannot work. And Ehrman is using the exact same reasoning. Then Craig does something absolutely brutal. He names the error. He says, in the grand tradition of Hume's abject failure, I give you Ehrman's egregious error. He literally branded it. He gave Ehrman's mistake a title. That is debate dominance right there. Because now everyone watching will remember that phrase, Ehrman's egregious error. It sticks in your mind, and the substance behind it is even worse for Ehrman. Craig explains that Ehrman only looks at one factor when calculating probability. He completely ignores everything else, and that is mathematically fallacious. Not philosophically questionable, not debatable, mathematically wrong. You cannot argue with math.
Fallacious. The probability of the resurrection could still be very high, even though the probability of R on B alone is terribly low. Specifically, Dr. Ehrman just ignores the crucial factors of the probability of the naturalistic alternatives to the resurrection. If these are sufficiently low, they outbalance any intrinsic improbability of the resurrection hypothesis. And we can see this by looking at the general form of the probability calculus. It has the form of x over x plus y because the numerator is reproduced in the denominator. Now notice that as y tends towards 0, the value of this ratio tends toward 1, which in probability theory means absolute certainty. So what is really crucial here is the probability of y, which represents the intrinsic probability and explanatory power of those naturalistic alternatives to Jesus' resurrection. So Dr. Ehrman can't just ignore these or present fanciful hypotheses. In order to explain that the resurrection is improbable, he needs not only to tear down all of the evidence for the resurrection, but he needs to erect a positive case of his own in favor of some naturalistic alternatives. But that's not all. Notice that Dr. Ehrman just assumes that the probability of the resurrection on our background knowledge is very low. But here I think he's confused. What, after all, is the resurrection hypothesis? It is the hypothesis that Jesus rose supernaturally from the dead. It is not the hypothesis that Jesus rose naturally from the dead. That Jesus rose naturally from the dead is fantastically improbable. But I see no reason whatsoever to think that it is improbable that God raised Jesus from the dead. In order to show that that hypothesis is improbable, you'd have to show that God's existence is improbable. But Dr. Ehrman says that the historian cannot say anything about God. Therefore, he cannot say that God's existence is improbable. But if he can't say that, neither can he say that the resurrection of Jesus is improbable. So Dr. Ehrman's position is literally self-refuting. But it gets even worse. There's another version of Dr. Ehrman's objection, which is even more obviously fallacious than Ehrman's egregious error, and I call it Bart's blunder. Here it is. Since historians can establish only what probably happened in the past, they cannot show that miracles happened, since this would involve a contradiction, that the most improbable event is the most probable. In truth, there's no contradiction here at all, because we're talking about two different probabilities. The probability of the resurrection on the background knowledge and the evidence versus the probability of the resurrection on the background knowledge alone. And it's not at all surprising that the first may be very high, while the second might be very low. There's no contradiction at all. So in sum, Dr. Ehrman's fundamental objection against the resurrection hypothesis is demonstrably fallacious.
Now watch what happens here, because Craig is not done. He just exposed one fatal flaw in Ehrman's reasoning, and you would think that would be enough. But no, Craig goes deeper, and what he finds is somehow even worse. See, this is what separates a good debater from a great one. A good debater finds one problem and hammers it. A great debater shows you that the problems are systemic, that the entire framework is broken, and that is exactly what Craig is doing. He explains that even if the resurrection seems improbable on background knowledge alone, that does not mean it is improbable overall. Because you have to consider the evidence. You have to consider the alternative explanations. You have to look at the full picture. And Ehrman is not doing that. He is cherry-picking one variable and pretending the rest do not exist. And then Craig drops the second bomb. He says it gets even worse. There is another version of Ehrman's objection, which is even more obviously fallacious than Ehrman's egregious error. And I call it Bart's blunder. Bart's blunder. He did it again. He named another error. In one rebuttal, Craig has given Ehrman's mistakes two humiliating titles. This is intellectual destruction on a level you rarely see in academic debates. And what is Bart's blunder exactly? Ehrman argued that historians cannot show miracles happened because that would mean the most improbable event is the most probable, and he thinks that is a contradiction. But Craig shows there is no contradiction, because you are talking about two different probabilities. The probability based on background knowledge versus the probability based on background knowledge plus evidence. Those are not the same thing. Ehrman confused them, and that confusion is the blunder. Craig then delivers the knockout line. Dr. Ehrman's fundamental objection against the resurrection hypothesis is demonstrably fallacious. Demonstrably. That word matters. It means Craig is not just asserting this, he showed it. Step by step, with logic, with math, with philosophy. Ehrman's core argument does not just have problems, it is probably wrong.
Now, Hume had an excuse for his abject failure. The probability calculus hadn't yet been developed in his day. But today, New Testament theologians no longer have any excuse for using such demonstrably fallacious reasoning. Now, Dr. Ehrman has already shown himself to have the scholarly objectivity to reverse himself on the power of the empirical evidence. But in this case, a reversal of his position is mathematically obligatory. And I hope that the same scholarly objectivity that led him to reverse himself with respect to those four facts will now also lead him to rethink his opposition to the resurrection hypothesis. Now, in my few remaining minutes, let me return to that first contention and deal with Dr. Ehrman's responses there. He said that there are a sort of wish list that he would offer for historical sources, and that the Gospels are not as good as we would want. Well, let me simply say that this wish list is so idealistic as to be practically irrelevant to the work of the practicing historian. The only purpose that it serves is to set a psychological purpose of setting the bar so unrealistically high that the Gospels appear to fall short by comparison. In fact, however, no sources for ancient history measure up to this wish list. And the New Testament documents, I think, do fulfill 4 out of the 6 in his list unproblematically, and the other 2 partially. So the real question is, not are they as good as we would like, but are they good enough to establish those 4 facts? And they certainly are. What about all the inconsistencies? Well, remember I said you'd have to show 3 things to put this argument through. First, that they're irresolvable. Second, that they lie at the heart of the narrative rather than in the details, which in fact they do. And thirdly, you'd have to show that all of the documents are on equal claimed historical credibility, since inconsistencies in a later, less reliable source doesn't undermine an earlier, more credible source. So I don't think that really he's shown that these things, these inconsistencies, invalidate the narratives. In fact, when you look at them, the Gospels all agree that Jesus of Nazareth was crucified in Jerusalem by Roman authority during the Passover feast, having been arrested and convicted on charges of blasphemy by the Jewish Sanhedrin, and then slandered before the Roman governor Pilate on charges of treason. He died within several hours and was buried Friday afternoon by Joseph of Arimathea in a tomb, which was sealed with a stone. Certain women followers of Jesus, including Mary Magdalene, who is always named, having observed his interment, visited his tomb early on Sunday morning, only to find it empty. Thereafter, Jesus appeared alive from the dead to his disciples, including Peter, who then became proclaimers of the message of his resurrection. All 4 Gospels attest to all of those facts. More details could be added simply by including facts mentioned in 3 of the Gospels, 3 out of the 4. And as I say, the bottom line is that Dr. Ehrman himself admits now, since 2003, that despite the inconsistencies, these 4 facts are historical. In fact, N.T. Wright, at the end of his massive study of the resurrection narratives, states that the empty tomb and appearances have a historical probability which is so high as to be virtually certain, like the death of Augustus in AD 14 or the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. That is incredible. So I think that the debate really isn't over these facts. The question is the best explanation of the facts. And the objection that Professor Ehrman offers is not the objection of a historian. This is not a historical argument. This is a philosophical argument which is based upon a misunderstanding of the probabilities involved. Once that is cleared up, I see no reason at all why one cannot infer on the basis of the historical evidence that Jesus of Nazareth rose from the dead.
And here is where Craig twists the knife, because he is not content to just win the argument. He wants you to understand why this matters for the broader conversation about history and faith. Craig makes an interesting point. He says David Hume, who originally made this argument back in the 1700s, had an excuse. The probability calculus had not been fully developed yet. Hume was working with limited tools. But Craig says today, New Testament scholars have no excuse for using this demonstrably fallacious reasoning. The math exists now. The philosophy has advanced. There is no reason to keep making this mistake unless you want to reach a predetermined conclusion. And this is something I want you to understand about how these debates often work. A lot of skeptical arguments against Christianity are not actually new. They are recycled. They get passed down from generation to generation without anyone stopping to ask, wait, has anyone actually refuted this already? And the answer is often yes. Philosophers dismantled these arguments decades or even centuries ago, but they keep coming back because they sound convincing to people who have not studied the responses. This is actually a pattern you see throughout intellectual history. Bad arguments have a way of surviving long past their expiration date. They get repeated in popular books. They get taught in classrooms. And each new generation thinks they are hearing something fresh when really they are hearing something that was already addressed by scholars their grandparents never read. Craig then addresses Ehrman's wish list for historical sources. sources. Ehrman basically said, the Gospels are not as good as we would like them to be. And Craig points out that this standard is so high that virtually no ancient source would meet it. It is a game you cannot win because the goalposts are set in the clouds. But here's what Craig emphasizes. The real question is not, are these sources perfect? The question is, are they good enough to establish those 4 facts? The burial, the empty tomb, the appearances, the origin of belief. And Craig argues they absolutely are, using the same criteria that historians use for everything else. He points out that all 4 Gospels agree on the core facts. Jesus was crucified. He was buried by Joseph of Arimathea. The tomb was found empty. He appeared to his followers. They proclaimed his resurrection. The differences are in the peripheral details, not the central claims. And Craig ends with total confidence. He says, I see no reason at all why one cannot infer on the basis of the historical evidence that Jesus of Nazareth rose from the dead. That is how you close a rebuttal. No hedging, no maybe, just a clear, confident declaration that the evidence supports the resurrection. And after watching Craig systematically dismantle every objection Ehrman raised, it is hard to disagree. So what do you guys think of this? Leave your thoughts down in the comments. Please like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next video.